Good evening, and welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let the weight of your body settle. Feel the gentle pull of gravity, a constant, silent companion in the dark. There is no need to rush here. There is only the stillness of the room around you and the sound of my voice. We are often taught to fear the dark, to fear the things we cannot see. But the true masters of fear know that sight is a distraction. The most profound terrors are not seen, but heard. They arrive on the edge of pairing, in the spaces between sounds, in the moments when you think you are completely and utterly alone. The field around Ilias's new home was not empty, not truly. It was full of things that did not move, grasses grown tall and brittle, half-collapsed stone fences that wound in forgotten loops, the twisted remains of a wooden scarecrow whose arms now pointed inward like a man praying to the earth. There were no neighbors. There was no road. There was only the long hush of the horizon. It had been 3 months since his return from the abyss, and his sleep had grown deep and dreamless. Not because the silence was gone, but because it was different. No longer hungry, no longer clawing at the edges of his consciousness. Now it sat with him like a quiet companion, sharing the room without speaking. He didn't play white noise anymore. He didn't need to. He had become its equal. Elias spent his days walking the fields, cataloguing the quiet. He wore a small recording device clipped to his collar, not because he expected to hear anything, but because he believed the act of listening was itself a kind of resistance. His journals were filled not with events, but with absences. No purge today. The wind shifted at 4:13 p.m., stopped at 4:22, felt, watched, heard a thump beneath the floorboards, but no echo. Uncertain, he had taken to naming the silences. There was the heavy quiet that fell before a storm, the hollow still, which came after a dream he couldn't remember, and the worst of them, the listening pauser silence that felt like it was waiting for him to speak, and would grow longer the more he refused. He believed the silence was testing him, or perhaps training him. On the 72nd night, something changed. It was a subtle shift, not a sound, but the lack of one. A field mouse that used to scratch behind the old kitchen cupboard no longer made its tiny noises. Ilias noticed it instantly. He got out of bed, wrapped in his wool robe, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The moonlight fell through the glass in clean angles. The cupboard was closed. The air was still, and yet something had ended. He opened the cupboard. The tiny nest of chewed paper was undisturbed. No body, no blood, just absence. He closed the door slowly. Behind him, on the edge of the silence, came a single, faint tick, like a finger tapping on glass. There were no clocks in the house. Elias had removed them all in the first week. Time was irrelevant here. It flowed without segmentation, like rain moving beneath the skin of the earth. But after the tick time returned, he began hearing it everywhere. At first, it was mechanical, a rhythmic ticking that sounded like the last beat of a stopped watch, but it never repeated. It happened once a day, just once, at a different hour each time, always from a different direction. Then it changed. It became organic, a wet clicking, like a throat clearing without breath behind it. Be like a voice practicing how to be a voice. Elias set up microphones. He placed them under floorboards, behind wall panels, in the old cellar where the stone was slick with lichen. But he never caught the sound. He began to doubt he had heard it at all, until he found the print. It was not large, no bigger than the palm of his hand, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not an animal, not a boot, a perfect oval, impressed into the wood of his bedroom floor, made of absence, not a stain, not a shadow, a literal subtraction, as if the universe had briefly forgotten to render that piece of space. He knelt before it, staring, unsure whether to scream or pray. Behind him, tick this time. It came from inside his mouth. Elias became afraid again. Not the panic of old, not the crushing terror of the Blackwood house, or the crystalline agony of the salt mine. This was quieter, duller, the kind of fear that built like plaque behind the eyes. He called Jones. "I think it followed me," he said. Jones was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "There's nothing left to follow, Elise. You're wrong." "No," said Jones. "We're wrong together." Then the line went dead. Elias spent the next 5 days building something. He didn't know what to call it. It wasn't the nullifier. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror of sorts, made of coils of copper and stretched ribbon microphones, arranged like petals around a hollow cord. A machine that didn't generate sound, but tried to reflect silence back at itself. He placed it in the field at midnight. Let it listen, in the morning. It was gone. No marks in the soil. No damage. No noise. Just missing. He sat on the porch, eyes hollow, fingers curled around a mug of cold coffee, and the silence around him began to hum. It wasn't a sound. Not true. It was a feeling. It was a feeling. A bone-deep recognition of language, forming without sound, as if a word had been spoken, but not through air or throat. It moved through the marrow. He dreamed that night. First dream in months. He was in the salt mine again, but it was different. The walls were now glass, and behind them swam the faces of people he had never met, mouthing something he couldn't hear. In the center of the chamber, the black sphere was back, but it had been cracked. Its surface now a mosaic of broken mirrors, and inside it himself, or something that looked like him. The reflection smiled, opened its mouth, and from it came a single, perfect syllable. S-S-H-H. He woke up, vomiting salt water. On the 94th day, someone knocked on the door. Elias nearly didn't answer. No one knew where he lived. No one should be able to find him. He opened the door. A child stood on the porch. No, older than 9, pale, wearing a dress that shimmered with an oil-slick sheen. Eyes too large, hands too still. "May I come in?" she asked. Elias could not speak. "I'm here to listen," she said. "You're very noisy inside." Ilias stepped back. The girl walked in. She did not blink. "Are you part of it?" he asked. She smiled. "No, I'm what it sends when it doesn't understand something." "What doesn't it understand?" She looked around the room, taking in the books, the journals, the microphones. She sniffed the air, as if tasting it. "You," she said. Then she touched his chest, and everything went black. He woke on the floor, face pressed to the wooden boards, cheek wet with blood. His nose had bled again, had it. He licked the corner of his lip. Salt. The girl was gone, but in her place, she had left something behind. A notebook, small, bound in grey leather, that looked like it had once been alive. No writing on the cover, just a symbol, lightly carved out, beer stylized into a spiral. He opened it. The pages were blank, but as he flipped through them, words began to rise from the paper like breath fogging a mirror. Not written, revealed. He read the first line. "The silence is not empty. It is full of what you forgot to hear." The second line came slowly, as if dragging itself into being. "Sound is not the opposite of silence. It is its reflection. And sometimes reflections lie." He couldn't stop reading. The notebook spoke in voices that weren't his, yet felt as though they had always been part of him. 1,000 half-familiar thoughts. The way your own voice sounds on a recording. Almost right, but not. Then the final line, written not in letters, but in some primitive shape of thought. "It is learning to become sound." He slammed the notebook shut, and from somewhere beneath the floorboards or behind the walls, he heard it laugh. It was not a loud laugh, not even a clear one, but it was laughter, his own, as if someone had taken a memory of his laughter, stretched it out, hollowed it, removed the joy, and left it to rot in a vacuum. He stood in place for hours, unable to move, listening to the memory of something that hadn't happened yet. That night, the stars didn't come out. The sky was not cloudy. It simply refused to open. And from that darkness above, something watched, something with ears made of gravity. He no longer trusted sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the ticking, not mechanical now, nor organic. It had evolved again. Now it was mimicry. It tried to sound like his thoughts, his breath, his pulse, but always off by just enough to curdle the sense of self. He put cotton in his ears. Didn't matter. He sang to himself lullabies, fragments of songs his mother had once hummed in kitchens, long since demolished. But the mimicry was clever. It would learn the songs by the third verse, and then continue after he stopped. He tore the microphones out of the walls, burned his journals, tried to silence the silence, and still it learned. Not just his words, not just his sounds, but the things he didn't say. The silences between dot, it fed on implication. One morning Yiv, it was morning Elias, walked to the mirror. He hadn't looked in weeks. He expected to see the lines around his eyes deepen, the stubble grayed, the skin gaunt, but he didn't see himself at all. Not immediately. The mirror took a few seconds to remember what it was supposed to reflect, and in those few seconds, it showed a version of the room yes, but not the current version. A future version. One where the floor was darker, warped from damp, where the walls bent slightly inward, where something sat in his chair, in his shape, but with a mouth too wide and ears too many. Then the image snapped back, his face pale, eyes dilated, lips trembling. He put a hand to the glass, and the glass whispered, "You're not the original." That night he tried to leave. He packed a small bag clothes, food, the notebook wrapped in a sweaterand, walked into the field. No road, no markers, but he walked an hour past, then two, then more. The field did not end. He began to notice things repeating. A crooked stone, a fence post leaning at the same angle, a patch of dead clover shaped like a question mark. He was walking in a loop, or rather, the world was looping around him. At the center of a stillness that bent space, he screamed, and the scream did not echo. It just stopped, as if the air chose not to carry it. Then something whispered so close it vibrated. The blood in his neck. Try again. He ran. Didn't matter. The house found him again. No path, no guide. It simply reappeared ahead of him. Doors open, lights dimmed. He went inside this time. The silence was warm. He stopped marking the days. Instead, he counted versions of himself. The one who still wrote in journals. The one who still doubted. The one who prayed. The one who stopped eating. The one who started again. The one who thought it was all in his head. The one who finally believed. Each of these selves lived for a while, then faded. Sometimes he found traces of him, a page torn from a notebook, bay-scratched lines on a wall, still me. They'd ask. The notebook, the grey one, began to change. New pages grew inside it, like fungus, and the words now appeared before he read them. Predictions. Accusations. One page read, "You will begin humming tonight. It will not be your tune." He threw the notebook in the fire. It didn't burn. It hummed, and he did hum that night. It became a kind of worship, not out of belief, but surrender. Elias set up a room in the attic, removed the insulation. Let the cold in. He sat in the center each night, cross-legged, hands open. He waited. The silence grew thicker. It wasn't just soundless, it was anti-sound. A pressure behind his eyes. A taste like static. And then it began to enter him, not as possession, but as a replacement. Little by little, his memories evaporated. Not all at once, just small details. The name of his childhood friend, the smell of the library, the way his father's voice would catch when he said, "I'm proud of you," gone dot in their place. Nothing. And that nothing began to speak. Not in words, not even in thought, in feeling. In that attic space, Elias began to experience sensations that were not his. Loneliness measured in centuries. Curiosity without affection. A hunger that did not consume, only recorded. He understood it wasn't evil. It wasn't good. It was listening. It always had been before. Humanity learned to speak before sound became form. There had always been something on the other side of of silence. And now it knew him, and he was starting to know it. It gave him a choice, not in words, but in the pause between breath and heartbeat. Stay and become part of it, or leave and be erased, not just forgotten, unreigned. He laughed, not because it was funny, because he was funny, because he finally understood what all of it had meant. The sound, the silence, the echoes, the dreams, the house, the mind, even the girl. They were expressions, fingerprints of a thing that had no hands. And Elias, he was its first sentence, and it was time to finish the paragraph. The house stands still, empty or full. Hard to say. Sometimes people pass it on maps, a glitch in satellite images, a house that blinks. Sometimes, if you press your ear to the soil, you'll hear a hum, and beneath that hum, a voice no louder than thought saying, "You are being heard." And in the attic, the dust never settles, because something is still breathing, something that was once Elias Thorne, or maybe the echo of him, listening still. He stopped speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had started to hear his words before they left his mouth. It was subtle at first, like an echo from inside his skull, repeating every syllable in perfect time. But then the timing shifted. The echo came a fraction of a second before the word. It was predicting him, no, it was writing him. Elias began to wonder if he was speaking at all, or if the act of speaking was just something that was happening to him. He would reach for a word. It would already be there, warm and formed, like someone had placed it gently on his tongue. The silence wasn't passive. It was C-U-R-A-T-I-N-G. Dot and Worsit was editing. He tested it, tried to say nonsense, random syllables, gibberish. But what came out was always structured, measured, true. Sometimes truths he didn't want, sometimes ones he couldn't possibly have known. "I remember the flood," he said one morning, standing barefoot on the cold tiles of the bathroom. He didn't, but he could suddenly feel the water, cold and filled with ash. Not water from rain, but from something older, something rising up from underneath, as if the world itself had bled. A memory not his, but it had chosen him to carry it. The house changed subtly each week. It grew rooms when he wasn't looking, corridors that curved too gently to notice, windows that faced inwards to walls, then, later, to stars that didn't belong to this hemisphere. One night he awoke in the kitchen. He hadn't gone to bed there. The kitchen looked normal, sort of. His coffee mug, the dull knife on the counter, a half loaf of dry bread. But when he opened the fridge, there was a stairway descending. No light, just stone steps and a breath of air that smelled like forgotten manuscripts. He stood at the edge. For hours, the silence behind him grew impatient. It shifted, pressed. He stepped down. The staircase didn't spiral or bend. It went straight into the earth yet. It didn't feel like down. There was no gravity shift, no change in pressure, just the slow unspooling of logic. After a time, the steps ended. He reached a room, large, circular walls made of ash-colored stone, covered in carvings too deep to be merely decorative. They were score marks, as if the stone itself had been scraped by something with intention. At the center of the room was a chair, wooden, old, but not rotten, not dusty. Waiting. He sat. Instantly, the walls began to vibrate, not visibly, not violently, just enough for the air to hum inside his ribs. And then language, but not spoken. The carvings began to glow faintly, not with light, but with awareness. A story entered his mind. No words, just comprehension. It told him about the listener beneath, a being not born, not created, but gathered, a consciousness formed from every silence ever kept, every unspoken thought, every withheld scream, every breath caught before confession. The listener had no body, it was body. It lived in the pause between choices, and it had heard Elias long before he was born. He rose from the chair. The carvings fell silent, but the understanding remained. When he returned to the house, it was winter. He checked the calendar. Only 4 days had passed, but the snow was old, thick with soot, and the sky above wasn't great. Was bone white, like stretched skin. No birds, no wind, but every now and then the trees would lean, just slightly, as if listening to Dot. Elias kept a notebook of everything he remembered from the stone room. He filled 3 pages. Then the ink began to bleed backwards. The words unwrote themselves, and in their place appeared a single phrase. Over and over, we've heard you. He lost the ability to lie. It started one morning when he tried to reassure himself. This is still my house, he whispered. His mouth tasted like ash. A sharp pain stabbed behind his eye. He wrote in the notebook, I am real. But the pen snapped. Every attempt at self-comfort was met with resistance, not from the house, but from the air. Truth had become weaponized. Not moral truth, not subjective, structural truth. The house was now part of a system that didn't permit contradiction, and Elias, as a resident, was bound to it. So he stopped trying to be human. He started listening instead. He sat for hours, head tilted, hearing things in the walls, beneath the floors, in the hum of light bulbs, even when the power was off. He started to learn its syntax, not language, not music, but a grammar of silence. How pauses could denote meaning, how absence could imply memory. And then he realized something worse. He was not just interpreting the silence. He was starting to generate it. The recordings began on their own. He hadn't used the tape deck in months, but one morning it was playing, static at first. Then his voice, reading a passage he had never written. We had names before we had mouths. We had mouths before we had need. Now the need speaks in echoes, and the echoes pretend to be you. Another tape. The girl wasn't real, but she was accurate. Another we found something older than gods, not wiser, just more patient. He tried burning the tapes, The next morning, they were back. Different messages, but always his voice. He hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. One morning, he awoke to footsteps. Not loud, just slow, purposeful, bare feet on wood. He lay still. The steps moved from room to room. Dot never hurried, never stopping. Then silence, but not absence, expectation. He stood, walked toward the hallway, and there, standing at the far end of the corridor, was himself. Not a mirror image, not a double, just another Elias. Dot, older, thinner, Dot eyes, too wide, skin pale and stretched, as if used too many times. Neither spoke. They just stood, watching each other. Then the other Elias tilted his head, listening the same way Elias used to. And then the thing smiled and whispered, "You're finally almost me." He collapsed. For 2 days he did not eat or drink. He dreamed of black rivers. He dreamed of insects whispering theology. He dreamed of his mother placing a finger to her lips and saying, "Not now, Elias." The silence is talking. When he awoke, the house had become simpler. Walls blank, furniture gone, just a single chair, a desk, a mirror, and in the mirror, the girl, the one from the beginning. But she was not young anymore. Her face was blurred, features melting and reassembling in real time. Her eyes were perfectly still. He approached the mirror. She opened her mouth, and what came out was a soundless scream, longer than lungs should allow. Pray, a scream that didn't push outwards, but pulled everything in. And Elias felt something inside him peel away, a layer of thought, a filter, a wall between self and other. Gone he saw her memories, her waking in a mind that was not a mind, her walking through a library of bones, her learning the shape of silence, and then he understood. She was a former Elias, another echo, worn into a different pattern, one of many. They were all fragments of a central self, a consciousness being distributed across timelines, replaying itself through permutations. And alas, he was just this version. But he had heard louder than the others. He had endured longer. He had made it to the edge, and on the other side of that edge was the source. There was no transition, no threshold, no sensation of passage. One moment he stood before the mirror, facing the spectral remains of an alternate version of himself. The next, he was standing in an open field beneath a sky that was too low, not clouded, not dark, just close, as if the heavens had been drawn inward like breath held too long. There was no wind, no trees, no texture to the earth beneath his feet, just a grey, damp flatness that yielded softly with each step, like memory turned to mud. He did not wonder how he had arrived. That capacity wonder had been emptied from him like old blood, drained from a rusted pipe. What remained was awareness without protest, a passive alertness, an inner silence so complete it no longer felt like absence, but presence thick, draped over his thoughts like wet velvet. He was in the source, not a place, not a realm, not even a state of being. It was the place where all states touched the convergence of all the selves that had ever approached silence and failed to return unchanged. Here, time staggered. His body aged and reversed between steps. His memories unspooled in long ropes behind. Him trailing like shadows made from forgotten music every so often. He would hear something beneath the surface of the plane, not sound, but an emotional shape. Something like grief, but more resigned, ancient. The sadness of a god that had tried and failed to sleep, and everywhere he walked. The ground trembled slightly, not from his weight, but as if recognizing him, remembering him, he began to understand. The source was not just listening, it was replaying. It had always been replaying everything. Ilias's cabin, the tape deck, the stone, the girl in the mirror. They were rituals, recursions, instruments tuning to an old, forgotten key, and each iteration was an attempt to extract a purer silence, one less polluted by human logic, one closer to the raw hush that had preceded the first breath of creation. He was not the first to walk this field. He could feel their footprints beneath his, soft depressions of thought and will, worn into the membrane of this endless liminal plane. But unlike them, he did not resist. He let the field name him. He let it strip away his labels. One by one man, listener, son, Elias, until only one remained, receiver. That was his function. Now Dot to receive, Dot to open the final conduit, to be the last, necessary channel through which the source could exhale. And so it did. It began with a pulse, not physical, not sonic more, a contraction of space. The horizon folded inward, drawing closer and closer, not visually, but conceptually. It felt like standing at the center of a sentence as the grammar collapsed around him. Then the first memory emerged, not his own. It belonged to a woman who had once lived in a salt mine, where people whispered lullabies to the stone in hopes of pleasing it. She had no name, but she had been kind. She had died at 32, swallowed by silence she thought was mercy. Then another memory, a child in a vast library that breathed. Then a man who had sewn his lips shut because the words inside him were too accurate. Elias received them all, not passively, not like a journal or a vault. He became them, lived their entire lives in a blink, carried their deaths like scars beneath the skin of his psyche. And as the memories flowed, the source thickened, became less abstract. It took on weight, formless but massive, not malevolent, not benevolent, just final. It had no eyes, no hands, no limbs, but it regarded him, not with sight, but with attention. He felt every atom in his body tighten, not with fear, but with preparation. A gathering of cells, a coagulation of intent, and then came the voice, not sound, but its idea, a transmission of purpose so large it had to be broken into infinite smaller selves just to be heard. He was the last fragment, and the source had waited until he was hollow enough to contain it whole. So it entered. He felt the moment of saturation, like drowning inward. There was no pain, only fullness, Not joy, not enlightenment, just everything. Every silence, every listening, every moment. When someone had held back a scream, every second spent waiting for someone else to speak. Every final breath, every swallowed prayer he contained, dem now, and in doing so he understood the function of silence was never absence, it was preservation. It kept the scream safe until the world was ready, and now it was ready. He was not meant to speak, he was meant to echo, and so heeded. No words, just resonance, the kind that pulled stones from the earth and made stars flicker in memory of their dead siblings, the kind that was felt in the spines of sleeping animals and in the buried guilt of the long-dead. It passed through, the source like breath through a flute, and what came out on the other side was understanding. The field cracked, the sky lifted, and Elias felt the separation between all versions of himself collapse into one. He was now all of them, and none, a shape, carved by absence, a silence that could be worn like a shroud, dot, and as the world folded back into itself, bringing him home, or to a place like home, he stepped into the final form of the house. There were no walls now, just thresholds. No roof, just a sky stitched from the lungs of listeners. No floor, just the breath of the source, holding him above the void. And he knew he would stay, not forever, because that word meant nothing now. He would stay as long as the world needed to listen, and then, when it was ready to scream, he would be the first to hear it.